I was about 8 or 9 years old at the time. It was a quiet evening, and my mom had asked me to run up to the apartment to grab something. We were parked in the garage, and I remember hesitating for a moment before stepping into the elevator. Something about the silence of the building at night always made me uneasy, but I brushed it off. After all, I had done this 100 times before. When the elevator doors opened on our floor, I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. The light fixtures always had a faint buzz, and the air felt just a little colder than usual. Our apartment was at the end of the hall, and I hurried toward it, fumbling with the keys in my hand. Once inside, I grabbed what I needed, a bag my mom had left on the counter, and headed back out. I locked the door behind me and turned to walk back to the elevator. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, near the last flickering light, stood a figure. It was tall, much taller than any normal person, and hunched over, as if its head were too heavy for its body. Its outline was shadowy and distorted, as though it wasn't entirely solid. I couldn't see its face. In fact, I couldn't make out any features at all. It was just a black mass, but the air around it seemed wrong, like it was bending or rippling in a way I couldn't explain. What struck me most was the smoke, or at least, it looked like smoke. Wisps of dark mist rose from its body, swirling and dissipating into the cold air. The hallway felt heavier, like the air had turned dense and suffocating. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My feet felt glued to the floor, and all I could do was stare. The figure didn't move, but it felt like it was watching me. Even without eyes, I could feel its gaze piercing through me, chilling me to the bone. Finally, my instincts kicked in. I don't remember how, but I managed to break free from whatever hold it had on me. I turned and bolted toward the elevator, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My fingers trembled as I smashed the button to call the elevator, glancing over my shoulder every second to see if the figure had followed me. It didn't. The elevator doors opened with a ding, and I threw myself inside, frantically pressing the button for the garage. As the door slid shut, I caught one last glimpse of the hallway. It was empty. When I got back to the car, my mom asked if everything was okay. I nodded, clutching the bag tightly in my hands, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. That night, I didn't sleep. It was the first time I saw it, but it wouldn't be the last. It was about a year or two after that first encounter. By then, I had convinced myself that whatever I had seen that night was a trick of the light or my imagination playing games with me. Life went on, and I didn't think about it much until it happened again. I was home alone that evening. My parents had gone out, leaving me in charge of the house. It was supposed to be an easy, quiet night. Watch some TV, play some video games, maybe sneak a snack or two that I wasn't supposed to have. But the night didn't stay quiet for long. I remember sitting on the couch in the living room when I heard it, the sound of a window rattling. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The weather had been unpredictable lately, with strong gusts whipping through the city. But the rattling didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. I walked over to the window near the dining table and checked the latch. It was securely locked, yet the window kept shaking, as though someone was pushing against it from the outside. I leaned closer, peering through the glass into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the faint reflection of my own wide eyes staring back at me. Suddenly, the rattling stopped. For a moment, the silence was almost comforting. I backed away from the window, my pulse still racing, and told myself it was just the wind. But then another window started to shake. This time, it was upstairs. I froze. All the windows were supposed to be locked. There was no way the wind could be getting inside. My breath hitched as I stood at the bottom of the staircase, staring up into the shadowy hallway. The rattling grew louder, more violent, like someone or something was banging against the glass. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but curiosity, or maybe fear, got the better of me. Slowly, I climbed the stairs, each creak of the wooden steps echoing through the empty house. When I reached the top, I noticed that the door to the rooftop terrace was slightly ajar. That didn't make sense. It was always locked. My heart sank as I stepped closer, the cold draft from the open door brushing against my skin. I pushed the door open fully and stepped out onto the terrace. The night was still, eerily calm. There was no wind. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. I scanned the area, my eyes darting to every shadowed corner. But there was nothing out of the ordinary. That's when I realized something else. All the windows were perfectly still. They had stopped rattling the moment I stepped onto the terrace. It was as if they had been waiting for me to come up here. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with questions and fears. Was it all in my head, or was something trying to lure me out? I didn't stay to find out. I locked the terrace door and ran back downstairs, double-checking every window and door in the house. I turned on all the lights, trying to chase away the lingering shadows, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. That night, I didn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump. Every creak of the house sent chills down my spine. And even though the windows stayed shut for the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been there watching me. The third incident didn't feel as blatantly terrifying as the first two. At least not at first. It was subtler, more surreal. But somehow, it unnerved me even more than the others. It happened in 2020, during the middle of the year. By then, I had settled into the routine of online classes, spending most of my days staring at a computer screen. That afternoon felt no different from any other. I was sitting in the living room, reviewing notes for an upcoming test. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, warm and golden, casting long shadows across the floor. At around 4:20 p.m., I decided to take a break. I got up from the couch, stretched, and headed to my room to grab a notebook. On the way, I stopped by the kitchen to make some tea and toast a piece of bread. The house was quiet, comfortably so. As I stood by the kitchen counter, waiting for the toast to pop up, I let my mind wander. The smell of freshly brewed tea filled the air, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful, almost mundane. I carried my tea and snacked back to the living room, glancing at the clock on the wall as I passed. My heart sank. It was 5:31 p.m. I froze, staring at the clock in disbelief. That couldn't be right. I had only been away for a few minutes, 10 at most. How could over an hour have passed? I checked my phone, hoping it was just a glitch, but the time matched. 5:31 p.m. My thoughts raced as I tried to make sense of it. Had I really spent that long in the kitchen? Maybe I had gotten distracted. But no, I remembered everything clearly. Getting up from the couch, walking to my room, brewing the tea. It had all felt so quick, so ordinary, and yet the hour was gone. I sat back down at the desk, my tea and toast untouched. Something about the whole situation felt off. The air in the room seemed heavier, and the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was oppressive. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just a moment of absent-mindedness. Maybe I had zoned out while staring at the toaster, or spent longer making the tea than I realized. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. I couldn't concentrate on my studies, couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something had happened during that missing hour, something I couldn't remember. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the events over and over in my head, trying to find any detail I might have missed. But no matter how hard I tried, the hour remained a blank space, a void in my memory that refused to be filled. It wasn't like the other incidents. There was no shadowy figure, no rattling windows. But in some ways, that made it worse. At least with those, I had something tangible to fear, something I could point to and say, "That's what scared me." This was different. This was something I couldn't see, couldn't touch, couldn't even remember, and that made it all the more terrifying. After the strange incident with the missing hour, I found myself more cautious, more aware of the subtle oddities around me. The feeling of unease never truly went away. It lingered, like a faint shadow in the corner of my mind. A year or so later, another inexplicable event occurred, one that left me questioning my senses entirely. I was home alone, something that had become more common as I got older. It was a cloudy afternoon, the kind where the sky looks heavy, threatening rain but never delivering it. I had spent most of the day in my room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint noise coming from the living room. It was rhythmic, a soft tapping that grew louder with each repetition. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, though the windows were shut, and I couldn't feel any breeze. Still, I tried to ignore it, focusing on the video I was watching. But the tapping continued, persistent, unrelenting. Finally, curiosity and frustration got the better of me. I got up and walked down the hallway toward the source of the sound. As I approached the living room, the air seemed to change. It was subtle, but I could feel it heavier, colder. The windows, I realized, were rattling. Not just one, but all of them, as if a strong wind was pushing against the glass. I stared at them, confused. The curtains swayed slightly, but there was no draft, no sign of any breeze. I walked over to one of the windows and placed my hand on the glass. It was ice cold, far colder than it should have been. The rattling stopped for a moment, as if sensing my presence. Then, suddenly, it resumed, louder this time, more urgent. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about the way the windows moved didn't seem natural. It was too coordinated, too deliberate, like they were responding to something unseen. And then, for a brief moment, I thought I heard it, a whisper, faint and fleeting, carried on the non-existent wind. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't friendly. Panic set in, and I did what any terrified teenager would do. I ran. I bolted upstairs to the rooftop, hoping to find some rational explanation for what was happening. Maybe it was just a storm rolling in, or maybe a neighbor's prank. But when I stepped onto the rooftop, I froze. The air was still. The trees stood motionless. Not a single leaf stirred. There was no wind. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. How could the windows be rattling when there was no wind? And what was that whisper? I eventually went back inside, locking every door and window behind me. The rattling had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was oppressive, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every rustle, every faint noise made my heart race. I stayed under the covers, too scared to move, half expecting the windows to start rattling again. But they didn't. The house remained eerily quiet, as if whatever had caused the disturbance was content to let me stew in my own fear. Even now, I can't explain what happened that day. The memory of those rattling windows and that cold, heavy air still haunts me. It was a reminder that some things are beyond understanding, things that defy logic and reason, things that lurk just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. The final experience, the one that lingers in my mind even now, was unlike the others. It wasn't something I saw or heard. It wasn't physical. It was something far more unsettling. It was a quiet afternoon in 2020, sometime around mid-year. The world felt strange then, with everything upside down. But this moment was different. I was studying in the living room, trying to focus on an upcoming exam. The clock on my laptop read 4:20 p.m. After a while, I decided to take a break. I left my desk to grab a notebook from my room. On the way, I stopped by the bathroom and then went to the kitchen to grab a snack. A simple routine, nothing out of the ordinary. I even made myself a cup of tea, the kind that only takes a few minutes to brew. When I returned to the living room, something didn't feel right. The air had changed, heavier, almost pressing against me. I sat down, my tea in hand, and glanced at the clock on my laptop. It read 5:31 p.m. For a moment, I thought it was a glitch, a misstep of technology. I reached for my phone to confirm the time. It also read 5:31 p.m. Confusion turned into dread as I tried to piece together what had just happened. I replayed my steps in my mind. I had only been gone for, at most, 15 minutes. Enough time to grab a notebook, use the bathroom, and make tea. But the clock insisted that over an hour had passed. I stared at the time, my mind racing. Could I have lost track of time? Maybe I had zoned out in the kitchen, distracted by my thoughts. But that didn't make sense. I had been focused. Everything I did was intentional, methodical. And yet, the missing hour couldn't be denied. The longer I sat there, the more oppressive the air became. It was as if the house itself was aware of my confusion, feeding off it. The walls seemed closer, the room darker. Even the faint ticking of the clock on the wall sounded slower, heavier. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd read the clock wrong earlier. Maybe I'd taken longer than I thought. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. I'd had smaller moments before, instances where minutes seemed to stretch into hours, or hours disappeared in the blink of an eye. But this was different. It was deliberate. It felt like something had taken that hour from me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air in my room was heavy, suffocating. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound seemed amplified. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the missing hour was a fluke, a coincidence. But as I closed my eyes, I couldn't help but feel that something or someone was watching me. Even now, years later, I still think about that day. I still wonder where that hour went and why it was taken. Was it a warning? A glimpse into something I wasn't meant to understand? Or was it just the beginning?